Good morning, everyone. It's Ninian Wilson here, one of the digital reporters at the National, and I'm joined by Judith Duffy, our senior political reporter, and this is the Real Politics Live show. So,
morning, Ninian.
morning. Busy day today, lots on, but I think as always we'll start with the front page. So, main story is obviously the BBC blackout on Nicola Sturgeon's trip to the US. Very, very little reported on the BBC. There's been a couple of articles, but I think one of them really she was kind of a footnote in it, really, speaking more about Alok Sharma and presidency of COP26, and then mentioned that Nicola Sturgeon was in Washington. But to be honest, I think that's quite disappointing, not just because such an important visit from our First Minister of America should be big news. But actually, beyond Scotland, there was so much important. It touched on things like European energy security and how that is impinged by Russian invasion of Ukraine, things like that. So I think that it's disappointing to see that the BBC didn't pick up on that as something that affects not just us in Scotland, people that maybe pay closer attention to Scottish politics, but how it affected Europe on a wider scale.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, it was dismissed by opposition politics as an indie ref tour, of America, but the issues were discussed were a whole lot wider. And, she is the First Minister of the country. You think that would be of interest, that she's going to America and meeting influential figures. So it does seem a kind of strange decision not to have given it more prominence. But when comments made last night, although it was billed as an indie ref tour, she did raise the issue of independence and telling a US media outlet that it's still the government's plan to hold a referendum on independence in 2023. So it's kind of interesting that she's raising the case in America and obviously keeping that on the agenda as well. But this is one aspect of it, and there was a whole lot more which was to the tour. So it definitely should have been given more prominence, I think. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, it's a great article by one of our other reporters, Xander Richards. So anyone who's watching, I highly recommend you read it. One thing that I just wanted to touch on, also on our front page, is an exclusive interview from who's fast becoming our culture correspondent, Craig Meehan. He had an interview with Steve Coogan, which is really, really good. There's some great lines coming out of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting read, in terms of Steve Coogan talking about his reasons why he says basically Scotland voting yes would give a bloody nose to the English London establishment thinkers, and he is very pro-European, and Brexit is obviously the trigger, as with a lot of people that has changed his mind. But it's really interesting reading his take on it. So he kind of now thinks Britain's a very insular place, where Scotland's a kind of remained an outward-looking country. So he kind of come to that decision. And he's also worried that if Scotland did leave, then England would be stuck with a Conservative government forever, So as a Labour supporter, he's worried about that. So it is interesting that people are maybe now beginning to think about, not only the impact of Scotland leaving on Scotland, but also it will obviously have huge effects elsewhere in the UK. And it's kind of interesting when people kind of realise the reasons why Scotland maybe wants to go independent, but at the same time are thinking, well, what would this mean for the rest? What would it mean for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland? I mean, it's kind of interesting that people are beginning to think that way now.
Absolutely.
Really
I think it's quite interesting that people are Southport, just to say they're having to accept the pressing. It could be, it could well be, and we hope a reality soon. And if that is the case, then they need to start getting their house in order accordingly. So it's interesting in that way. But also, actually, I think just classic Steve Coogan humor. He's at the end. He said basically he was just Boris Johnson was just a light-hearted entertainer, and that's the way he should have stayed. Which I thought was
I
quite
think there
funny.
would be many that agree with that, absolutely. And interesting, it's also on the front page, we've got the story about, well, obviously there's a small football match, I understand, today. I'm not a huge football fan myself, but yes, I understand there's a small football match happening in Seville today. So in contrast to the coverage of Nicola Sturgeon's trip to the US, there's been plenty said about Murdo Fraser. He seems to have managed to secure a ticket. He's off in Seville, hanging out with the fans, and he seems to be writing extensively about his trip in various newspapers, which obviously begs the question that Holyrood is still sitting. So, it's interesting that, you know, he seems to think it's okay that he can jet off, and while he's essentially, you know, still at work, and join the fans when he's had a go at Nicola Sturgeon for going to the US and going on a tour, which is official Scottish government business. So there's quite a contrast in the approaches going on there.
Yeah, there definitely seems to be a double standard. It's, you know, the lad's on tour. It's like, oh, you know, off he goes. Who can blame him? Whereas with Nicola Sturgeon, it's this. I think one of the lines that was thrown out was that she can't be bothered being First Minister anymore, so she's jetting off to the United States, which is just absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, just another classic example of one rule for them, one rule, for the others. So sorry, yeah.
One rule for them, basically. I think that's how it goes.
One rule for them. And I think we should probably touch on the story that came out late yesterday that a Tory MP has been told not to come back to the parliamentary estate because they have, I think the person in question has been arrested on several charges. Obviously, because it's an ongoing investigation, we can't see too much. But the charges listed are indecent assault, sexual assault, rape, abusive position of trust, and misconduct in public office, which is incredibly serious.
Yeah, and I think the allegations span several years, you know, as well. So it does sound like an extremely serious case, and it's another scandal really to hit Westminster. It seems to be no end of them, but obviously the investigation's ongoing, and the MP in question hasn't been named. So it's a question of wait and see what comes out of that really at this stage. But so let's stay in Westminster, though. There's the other news of today really is the inflation rate. So the latest inflation figures were out this morning, and it's now hit 9%, which I don't think was much of a surprise to anyone. But, you know, just underlying the whole cost of living crisis. I think this is it's the fastest measured rate since records began in 1989, and it's the highest since 1982. So, I mean, it is a really serious situation. The Bank of England target is to keep it at 2%. So it's really, you know, a way above what it should be. There's no signs of it abating. There was a very worrying chat from, I can't remember who it was, but earlier this week was kind of talking about food price Armageddon. You know, I think it was one of the bosses of a kind of senior retail chain. So it's really, you know, the whole cost of living crisis is, you know, you can see it, you know, and just in the prices. I think it's affecting everybody. And the question is, what are the UK government going to do about it? I mean, they really have to take action. I think there's some chat of Rishi Sunak now kind of going to unveil more measures. There's some kind of talk of potential for that, but they have to take action now because it's affecting people now. I think that's the point. And these latest figures just kind of show you how serious it's getting.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've just had, I think there's been a lot said about what would the economy be like coming out of COVID, what's it going to be, you know, impacted by Brexit, and, you know, that it just seems like there's just no end to it, and that there's just a startling lack of action coming from the Tory front benches on it. Seems like a plaster over a gaping wound, really, as far as the response from the UK government is concerned.
And then you get the Tory MP made the outrageous comment that people should be, you know, getting second jobs in order to help with the cost of living crisis. And I mean, that's just incredibly unrealistic for most of the population. You know, it's not like they can pick up second jobs like an MP can, maybe, that's a lucrative, you know, couple of hours that they can earn a few £100. You know, you'd be talking about people having to work huge amounts of hours to get even an extra bit, and when does that leave time for everything else? So I think it's quite a kind of another example of the Tories not living in the real world and understanding exactly how people how people are trying to live and struggling to cope.
Yeah, it's very disheartening for the public to see that the people that are meant to be out there making decisions in our best interests seemingly have no idea what it is that the average citizen is actually going through, what they're experiencing, and what is feasible to help them out of this really serious situation. Quite right. Just lastly, there's a story that definitely worth keeping an eye on, is because I suspect it's probably not. It's going to roll on a little bit. The SNP are demanding an explanation for why a flight to Russia went ahead 2 days after Putin's invasion of the Ukraine. It flew from Inverness Airport. There were 3 people on board along with cargo. And initially, I think there was accusations that it was to do with a mistake from a local Inverness authority, but actually it's looking like that might not be the case, and that there was approval from the UK government. So we haven't really, there's not a massively clear answer on that yet, but hopefully we'll get some clarity. So that's definitely something worth keeping an eye out on.
Absolutely. And speaking of local authorities, that's another thing that obviously is still on the radar in terms of the councils now kind of coming out of their talks, and where we're getting more details on who's going to be controlling each of the councils. They've been trickling out over the past few days. So in Glasgow, the SNP and the Greens have reached a deal, and in Edinburgh, the SNP and the Greens are also eyeing up a kind of formal coalition. And I think there's potentially something on Moray coming up today as well, so that'll be an interesting one to watch. But it seems that it's difficult to keep track of, but we do have an excellent article which kind of is updating it as you go on the website, which is saying what's happening with each of the councils. So that's a great one if you go on the website and have a look at that. So it's just a case of seeing what happens, and still a few to be done, I think. But it's the council elections feel like ages ago now, but but it seems like they weren't that long ago at all. So
but still lots coming out on that. But yeah, just before we go, I just want to say, please, if you subscribe today to the National, then you'll get a 30-day free trial of all our premium content. So please do that. And just to say, if you also want to get all of today's news at thenational.scot, and when you do that, please subscribe to our newsletter. It gets sent out at 7 p.m. every day. It's the best way to get all your news in Scotland and beyond. Just aside from that, thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned.